the story of the Blackwater Disaster starts in the high, cold camps of the Grizzlies during the final weeks of 1898. The Van der Linde gang had been living on the run for a long time, but the world was changing around them. The frontier was closing, and the law was becoming more organized. The atmosphere in the camp was cold and filled with a quiet sense of worry. The ground was frozen hard, making the wagon wheels rattle and the horses struggle for footing. The air smelled of pine trees, wood smoke, and the sharp scent of a coming winter storm. You could hear the constant whistle of the wind through the mountain passes, making the small group feel very alone in the middle of the gray stone peaks. Dutch Van der Linde spent a lot of time looking toward the lowlands, thinking about the future. He knew the gang needed one big score to get enough money to leave this life behind. He was looking for a way out, and he thought he found it in the town of Blackwater. As the gang moved down from the mountains and toward the coast, the feeling of the story changed. They were moving into a place that represented the new world. Blackwater was a growing town with brick buildings, paved streets, and the first electric lights that hummed in the evening air. To men who were used to campfires and dirt paths, the town felt like a trap made of stone and iron. Dutch was convinced that a ferry boat carrying a massive amount of bank money was their best chance. However, the gang was not united on this idea. Arthur Morgan and Hosea Matthews were working on a different plan, something smaller and safer, involving real estate scams. They didn't trust the talk of the ferry, and they especially didn't trust Micah Bell, the man who had pushed the idea onto Dutch. This was the moment the leadership of the gang began to pull apart. The sound of the steam whistles from the harbor was loud and industrial, signaling that the old way of life was being pushed out by machines and banks. Deep within the docks of Blackwater, the gang prepared for the raid. Dutch, Micah, Bill, and Javier moved through the shadows of the harbor, hiding behind large crates and coils of heavy rope. The air near the water was thick with a gray fog that smelled of salt, coal smoke, and damp wood. It was a perfect place to hide, but it was also a perfect place for an ambush. The sound of the water hitting the wooden pilings was a constant, rhythmic slap that filled the silence between their footsteps. Dutch felt the pressure of the dark against his back and the steady pulse of his own heart as they reached the ferry boat. They were stepping into a situation they didn't fully understand, fueled by a desperate need for a score that would change everything. Dutch believed that if they could just get the money from the safe, they could disappear forever. While the ferry team was moving into position, Arthur and Hosea were across town. They were busy with their own work, completely unaware that the ferry job was about to turn into a disaster. Their part of the morning was quiet and professional. They were following the old way of doing things, working a lead that required patience rather than gunsmoke. The air where they stood was still and carried the taste of tobacco and street dust. They thought they had plenty of time, but the distance between them and Dutch was more than just a few city blocks. It was a gap in trust and communication that had been growing for weeks. The sound of a dog barking in the distance was the only thing breaking the silence of the morning, acting as a small warning that the peace was about to be shattered. The walk up the gangway of the ferry was the point where everything changed. Dutch led his small team up the wooden ramp, their boots making a heavy thud on the planks. The atmosphere was somber and very still. Once they stepped onto that boat, there was no going back to the way things used to be. The promise of $150,000 made Dutch overlook the risks and the warnings. He was focused on the golden prize, and he allowed his ambition to cloud his judgment. The vibration of the boat's engine was a deep throb that moved through the soles of their boots, making the world feel solid and heavy right before it exploded into chaos. Dutch reached out and touched the cold metal of the railing, unaware that the law was already watching them from the shadows of the lower decks. Deep on the deck of the ferry at dawn, the gang finally reached the safe. The air was cold, and the tension was so thick it was hard to breathe. This was the moment they realized the security was much higher than Micah had promised. The Pinkertons were not just patrolling the docks, they were already on the boat, hidden and waiting. The conversation between the outlaws stopped as they realized they were surrounded. There was only the sound of the safe dial turning and the heavy breathing of men who knew the door was closing behind them. A heavy door slammed shut somewhere below, and the sound was a final boom that signaled the end of the plan. The trap had been set perfectly, and the Van der Linde gang had walked right into the center of it. The experience of the arrival at the ferry ended with the gang standing in the middle of the deck, looking at the lawmen who were emerging from the fog. The gray mist was quickly replaced by the smell of gunpowder smoke as the first shots were fired. They were left holding the weight of an unopened safe while the world around them turned into a battlefield. The path of the gang was no longer about a score. It was about a bloody escape. The focus shifted from the money to the survival of the brothers standing next to them. They were in the heart of a modern city, and the law was determined to make an example of them. The flight into the mountains was the only option left, but the price of getting there was going to be higher than any of them could have imagined. The legacy of the first part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of false hope. You have seen the outlaws move from the safety of the mountains to the danger of the docks, chasing a dream that was actually a nightmare. You have felt the chill of the morning air and the weight of the bad decisions that led them to this deck. As the first red flashes of gunfire lit up the fog and the screaming started, the old version of the Van der Linde gang died. Dutch Van der Linde found his resolution in the trap of the ferry, leaving behind the world of the mountains for a world of bullets, blood, and a desperate run for the hills. The story of what happened on that boat and in the streets of Blackwater would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The chaos on the ferry boat turned into a nightmare the moment the first Pinkerton detective pulled his trigger. The air was suddenly filled with the smell of sulfur and the deafening cracks of repeated gunfire. On the deck of the boat, the atmosphere shifted from tense silence to a scene of absolute violence. Dutch van der Linde, Micah Bell, and the others were pinned down behind wooden crates, the splintering timber flying into the air as bullets chewed through their cover. This was the moment where the calm plan was completely destroyed. The fog that had once hidden them now worked against them, making it impossible to see where the law was coming from. You could hear the shouts of men and the high-pitched whistle of the ferry's steam, creating a wall of sound that made it hard to think. Dutch looked at the safe and then at his men, realizing that the money was no longer the priority. Survival was the only thing left. As the shootout moved toward the center of the deck, a young woman named Heidi McCourt was caught in the crossfire. She was a passenger on the boat, an innocent person who had nothing to do with the war between the outlaws and the state. In the heat of the moment, with the law closing in and the pressure of the trap breaking his mind, Dutch did something that would change the soul of the gang forever. He took Heidi as a hostage, but the situation spiraled out of control. In a moment of cold, sudden violence that shocked even his own men, Dutch killed her. The atmosphere on the boat turned from a battle into something much darker and more shameful. The sound of the gunshot that ended her life was a sharp, final note that seemed to echo louder than all the others. This was the era of the broken leader, where the high ideals of the Van der Linde gang were exposed as a lie. The fight then spilled from the ferry onto the docks of Blackwater. The gang had to fight their way through a wall of lawmen who were pouring out of the local police station and the nearby alleys. The ground beneath their boots was no longer just the wooden planks of the boat, but the hard, cold stones of the town square. The air was thick with the taste of salt and the heavy, stinging smoke of hundreds of revolvers. This part of the history is a story of a desperate retreat, a realization that the law was not going to stop until they were all dead or in chains. Every corner they turned revealed another line of men with rifles. The sound of bullets hitting the brick walls of the buildings was a constant, rhythmic tapping that sounded like heavy rain. Dutch moves with a sturdy and measured power, but his eyes were different now, filled with a frantic energy that his men had never seen before. Deep in the narrow streets of the town, the group was finally met by Arthur and Hosea, who had heard the commotion and realized their friends were in trouble. The atmosphere became cramped and incredibly dangerous. The warriors found that the town had become a maze of fire and lead. They were trapped between the harbor and the rising hills, with the Pinkertons closing the gap every second. The sound of horse hooves on the pavement was a loud and frantic clatter as the gang tried to reach the stable where their mounts were kept. This was the trial of the city streets, where the modern world showed the outlaws that it had more teeth than they expected. The air was filled with the vibration of the shouting and the constant, rolling thunder of the gunfight. During the escape toward the horses, a young member of the gang named Davy Callender was shot in the stomach. The atmosphere shifted to one of heavy, weighted tragedy. His brother, Mac, was also hit and became separated from the group in the chaos. The sight of Davy slumped over his saddle, his blood staining the leather, was a raw and heavy reminder of the cost of Dutch's ambition. The gang felt the steady chill of the realization that they were losing people they considered family. They moved with a desperate and forced strength, throwing the wounded onto their horses, while the law continued to swarm around them like hornets. The taste of copper and dust was heavy in their mouths as they finally broke through the initial line of the police and began to head for the edge of town. The ride out of Blackwater was a story of a scattered and broken army. The gang galloped through the outskirts, their horses' lungs heaving in the cold air. They left behind a town that was now fully awake and screaming for their heads. Behind them, the smoke from the ferry and the street fires rose into the morning sky, a black mark on the horizon. This part of the history is a story of the Great Flight, where the pride of the Van der Linde gang was replaced by the pure instinct to stay alive. The sound of the pursuing lawmen's whistles and shouts faded slightly as they reached the open country, but the danger was far from over. They were heading into the heart of a massive snowstorm that was beginning to swallow the mountains to the north. Deep in the woods just outside of town, the final trial of the second part took place as the gang stopped for a brief second to catch their breath. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and filled with a growing sense of dread. They realized that Jenny Kirk, another young member of the group, had also been killed in the escape. The conversation was short and filled with the sound of the wind beginning to pick up. They were a group of people who had lost their home, their money, and several of their brothers and sisters in the span of a few hours. The sound of the approaching storm was a low and constant moan, signaling that the true enemy was now the weather itself. They had escaped the guns of Blackwater, but they were now walking into a white void with no supplies and a dying man in their arms. The experience of the escape from Blackwater ends with the gang looking back at the distant, glowing lights of the city they had tried to rob. The gray of the morning had led to a sovereignty of the white snow. They carried the weight of the fallen and the silence of a plan that had failed in the worst possible way. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the exile. The focus would now shift to the climb into the mountains. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the ice into a world of freezing hunger and the struggle to keep the group together, the final legacy of the second part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the desperate run. You have seen the outlaws fight through the ferry and the streets to find the safety of the open road. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the shame from what Dutch did on that boat. As the orange glow of the town fires faded into the distance, and the first white flakes of the mountain snow appeared on their coats, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its second resolution in the blood on the cobblestones, leaving behind the world of the shore for a world of the frost, the dark, and a journey that was just beginning to test their souls. The climb into the grizzlies was a slow struggle against a world that had turned entirely white. As the Van der Linde gang left the rolling hills of West Elizabeth, the temperature dropped so sharply that the air felt like it was cutting into their skin. The atmosphere here was freezing, thin, and desperate. The ground beneath the horses was no longer solid earth, but a deep and treacherous layer of fresh snow that hid rocks and sudden drops. The air tasted of ice and the dry, biting scent of a mountain winter. The sound of the world was a high and constant scream, the sound of the wind whipping through the pine trees and the jagged stone peaks of the mountains. This part of the history is a story of the Great Ascent, a realization that the gang was no longer running from men, but from the raw power of nature. Dutch led the way at the front, his head bowed against the wind, realizing that if they didn't find shelter soon, the cold would finish what the Pinkertons had started in Blackwater. As the blizzard grew more violent, the atmosphere shifted to one of total isolation. The gang members could barely see the horse in front of them, and the shouting voices of the men were swallowed by the roar of the storm. This was the era of the White Void, where the atmosphere was one of blinding frost and the fear of being lost forever. You could see the way the horses breathed out thick clouds of steam that immediately turned to ice on their manes. This part of the history is a story of the broken line, a realization that the group was at its most vulnerable point. The sound of the horses' hooves hitting the deep snow was a muffled and heavy thud, a noise that emphasized how far they were from any civilization. They were moving blindly through the high passes, driven by the steady heat of the survival instinct and the raw weight of the responsibility for the wounded men in the wagons. Deep within the mountain pass, the atmosphere became cramped and suffocating despite the open space. The cliffs rose up on either side of them like massive walls of black glass, and the wind created whirlpools of snow that made it impossible to keep a straight path. This was the trial of the frozen spirit, where the atmosphere became one of heavy limbs and the dangerous urge to sleep. The warriors found that the air was so thin it made their chests ache, a realization that every step toward the summit was a battle for oxygen. The sound of the ice cracking under the weight of the wagons was a sharp and echoing snap, making the pass feel like the inside of a braking machine. This part of the history is a realization that the mountain didn't care about their crimes or their gold. It only cared about the cold. Arthur felt the constant pressure of the wind against his chest, a feeling of total and grounded endurance as he held the reins of a wagon carrying the dying Davy Calendar. At the highest point of the trail, the group encountered a massive drift of snow that had blocked the path. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and freezing as the men had to dismount and use their hands and shovels to clear a way for the horses. This was the trial of the collective strength, where the atmosphere became one of grunting effort and the spray of ice against their faces. The sound of the wind hitting the rock face above them was a deep and final boom, making the air feel like it was filled with the vibration of a falling mountain. When they finally broke through the drift and saw the descent on the other side, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and misted stillness. They could see a small, dark cluster of buildings in the valley below, an abandoned mining town called Coulter. It was a place of ghosts and old wood, but to the gang, it looked like a sanctuary. Descending into the valley, the journey led to the main street of the ghost town. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and somber, a realization that they were stepping into a tomb to stay alive. This part of the history is a story of the cold shelter, where the atmosphere is one of relief mixed with a deep, hollow exhaustion. You see the way the snow had piled up against the doors of the cabins, looking like white waves frozen in time. The air was still and carried the taste of ancient dust and the smell of old, dry timber. The sound of the wind whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls was a low and haunting note, signaling that the safety of Coulter was only a thin shield against the storm outside. The walk through the main cabin was a story of the end of the road. Dutch ordered the men to bring the wounded inside and start a fire with whatever wood they could find. This was a moment of raw and private reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the group was now trapped in a prison of ice. This part of the history is a story of the frozen hearth, where the tradition of the camp life met the reality of the disaster. The sound of their boots on the old wooden floorboards was a sharp and respectful click, making the outlaws feel solid and heavy in a world that was being buried in white. Dutch moved with a sturdy and measured power, his hand touching the cold stone of the fireplace, realizing that the way of the gang had led them to a place where the only victory was living to see the next morning. Deep in the heart of the main cabin at night, the final trial of the third part took place as the gang gathered around the first small flame. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that they were now a small circle of light in a massive, dark world. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared breath, where they watched the fire catch the wood and felt the first touch of warmth in hours. The conversation was short and focused on the basics of survival: food, blankets, and the health of the wounded. The sound of the blizzard hitting the roof was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was still waiting just outside the door. They had survived the climb, but they were now the prisoners of the mountain. The experience at Coulter ends with Arthur standing at the window of the cabin, looking out at the white wall of the storm. The gray of the pass had led to a sovereignty of the eternal frost. He carried the weight of the loss and the silence of the blizzard. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the winter exile. The focus would now shift to the hunt for food and the search for missing members, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the hunger into a world of frozen lakes empty bellies and the struggle to keep the fire burning. The final legacy of the third part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the frozen heart. You have seen the outlaws climb the mountains and find the shelter to find the anchor within their own spirit. You have felt the sting of the ice and the weight of the responsibility. As the orange glow of the small fire faded into the shadows of the cabin, and the first blue light of the mountain night appeared through the cracks, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Linde gang finds its third resolution in the silence of the ghost town, leaving behind the world of the city for a world of the ice, the wood, and a journey that was becoming a test of their very existence. The hunt for food and the search for the missing began in the early blue light of the following morning. The storm had slowed just enough for a man to see a few yards ahead, but the air remained bitter and sharp. The atmosphere here was quiet, hungry, and desperate. The ground around the camp at Coulter was a deep sea of white that required the men to lift their legs high with every step, a movement that drained their energy quickly. The air tasted of nothing but cold and the faint, metallic scent of the rifles they carried. The sound of the world was a low and constant moan of the wind through the eaves of the broken cabins, making the town feel like a hollow shell. Dutch and Hosea knew that the horses and the people could not survive long without meat. And more importantly, they knew that John Marston had not returned from his scout the night before. This part of the history is a story of the frozen hunt, a realization that the gang was now a pack of wolves trying to survive in a land that wanted them dead. Arthur Morgan and Javier Escula were tasked with finding John, leading their horses out into the deep drifts toward the higher ridges where he was last seen. The atmosphere shifted to one of intense focus as they left the shelter of the buildings. This was the era of the high trail, where the atmosphere was one of biting frost and the fear of a hidden cliff. You could see the way the horses struggled, their chests heaving as they pushed through snow that reached their bellies. This part of the history is a story of the brothers' search, a realization that the bonds of the gang were the only thing keeping them from falling apart. The sound of the horses' breathing was a loud and rhythmic huff, a noise that felt like the only sign of life in a world of ice. They moved upward, driven by a steady sense of duty and the raw weight of the knowledge that John was likely freezing to death somewhere above them. Deep within the narrow ravines of the high peaks, the atmosphere became cramped and incredibly cold. Arthur and Javier had to navigate through stone passages where the ice hung in massive, jagged teeth from the rock walls. This was the trial of the frozen echoes, where the atmosphere became one of listening for a voice that might never answer. The warriors found that the wind played tricks on them, carrying sounds of cracking ice that could be mistaken for a distant shout. The sound of a rifle shot being fired into the air to signal John was a sharp and echoing crack, making the ravine feel like the inside of a hollow bone. This part of the history is a realization that the mountain was a maze designed to swallow the unwary. Arthur felt the constant pressure of the cold against his joints, a feeling of total and grounded endurance as he called out into the white haze. At the edge of a steep, icy ledge, they finally found John's horse, dead and half buried in the snow. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and silent as they looked down into a dark crevice where John was trapped. This was the trial of the rescue, where the atmosphere became one of physical strain and the spray of snow as they pulled him out. The sound of John's voice, weak and trembling, was a thin and fragile note that cut through the wind. He had been attacked by wolves, his face torn and his body reaching the limit of what a human can stand. When they finally got him onto Arthur's horse, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and misted stillness. They were miles from camp with a wounded man, and the predators that had smelled John's blood were now circling in the shadows of the pines. The ride back toward Coulter was a story of the defensive retreat. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and dangerous, a realization that they were being hunted. This part of the history is a story of the gray wolves, where the atmosphere is one of fast reflexes and the smell of gunpowder. You see the way the wolves moved through the deep snow, their dark shapes looking like ghosts against the white. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and iron as Arthur drew his sawed-off shotgun to defend the group. The sound of the wolves snarling was a high and grating rattle, signaling that the hunger of the mountain was not just a metaphor. Arthur moved with a sturdy and measured power, his shots clearing a path through the pack, realizing that the survival of the gang required a level of brutality they had hoped to leave behind in Blackwater. Walk back into the main street of Coulter was a story of a small victory in a losing war. The gang members came out of the cabins to help John off the horse, their faces a mix of relief and growing exhaustion. This was a moment of raw and heavy reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that every successful mission was just a stay of execution. This part of the history is a story of the bloody bandage, where the medicine of the trail met the reality of the mountain's teeth. The sound of the horses being led back to the makeshift stables was a dull and respectful thud, making the outlaws feel solid and heavy in a world that was trying to erase them. Arthur moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand helping to carry John into the warmth, realizing that the way of the gang was now a cycle of saving each other from the brink of death. Deep in the heart of the camp later that day, the final trial of the fourth part took place as Pearson, the camp cook, reported that there was still no food. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the next journey had to be for meat. This is a story of the sovereignty of the empty belly, where the pride of the outlaws was stripped away by the basic need to eat. The conversation was short and focused on a distant smoke signal spotted by Charles Smith, suggesting that someone else was living in these mountains. The sound of the fire popping in the grate was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was now the competition for resources. They had found their brother, but they had also found that they were not alone in the grizzlies. The experience of the first hunt ends with Arthur standing at the edge of the camp, looking toward the distant smoke. The blue of the morning had led to a sovereignty of the gray evening. He carried the weight of the rescue and the silence of the hungry camp. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the competitor. The focus would now shift to the raid on the O'Driscoll camp. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the blood into a world of old rivalries, stolen supplies, and the realization that their past had followed them into the snow. The final legacy of the fourth part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the shared burden. You have seen the outlaws search the high ridges and fight the wolves to find the life within their own circle. You have felt the sting of the wind and the weight of the rescue. As the orange glow of the camp lanterns faded into the shadows of the trees and the first stars appeared over the peaks, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its fourth resolution in the return of the missing man, leaving behind the world of the search for a world of the raid, the rifle, and a journey that was turning from survival into war. The raid on the rival camp began as the sun struggled to rise over the frozen peaks, casting a pale, gray light over the valley. Dutch had gathered the able-bodied men, including Arthur, Bill, and Micah, to ride out toward the smoke they had seen in the distance. The atmosphere here was cold, aggressive, and focused. The ground beneath the horses was a mix of deep snow and hidden sheets of ice that made the climb toward the ridge a slow, grinding process. The air tasted of wood smoke and the sharp, oily scent of gun grease. The sound of the world was a low and constant crunch, the sound of the horses' hooves breaking through the frozen crust of the snow, making the group feel like a hunting pack closing in on its prey. Dutch led the way with a quiet intensity, realizing that the survival of his people depended on taking what belonged to another. They were looking for the O'Driscolls, a rival gang that had been a thorn in Dutch's side for many years. As the men reached the ridge overlooking the O'Driscoll hideout, the atmosphere shifted to one of lethal observation. They found a small ranch house tucked into a hollow, surrounded by outbuildings and guarded by men in heavy coats who were unsuspecting of the danger above. This was the era of the mountain ambush, where the atmosphere was one of held breaths and the clicking of rifle hammers. You could see the way the men fanned out along the rim of the hollow, their figures silhouetted against the white snow. This part of the history is a story of the old grudge, a realization that the war between Dutch and Combe O'Driscoll had followed them even into this desolate wasteland. The sound of a man laughing by a fire below was a sharp and mocking note, a noise that signaled the peace was about to end. The outlaws moved with a sturdy and measured might, checking their sights and waiting for the signal to strike. Deep within the hollow, the atmosphere became cramped and violent the moment the first shot was fired. Arthur and the others charged down the slope, the snow flying up in white clouds behind them as they opened fire on the O'Driscoll camp. This was the trial of the ranch house battle, where the atmosphere became one of sudden chaos and the heavy smell of black powder. The warriors found that the buildings provided little cover, and the fight quickly turned into a series of close-range gunfights in the snow. The sound of bullets splintering the wooden fences was a sharp and constant crack, making the ranch feel like the inside of a breaking crate. This part of the history is a realization that the O'Driscolls were planning a score of their own, as they found maps and plans for a train robbery hidden in the house. Arthur felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the smoke against his eyes, a feeling of total and grounded focus. At the center of the ranch house, the group encountered the last of the defenders who had barricaded themselves inside. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suffocating as the men kicked in the doors and cleared the rooms one by one. This was the trial of the final stand, where the atmosphere became one of shouting and the spray of splinters. The sound of a shotgun blast indoors was a deep and deafening boom, making the air feel like it was filled with the vibration of a drum. When the last O'Driscoll fell, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and somber stillness. The men began to search the house for the food they desperately needed, but they found something else entirely. In a small, dark cellar, they discovered a woman named Sadie Adler, who had been hiding from the men who had murdered her husband and burned her home. Leaving the cellar, the journey led back out into the cold air of the courtyard. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and heavy with the weight of Sadie's grief. This part of the history is a story of the rescued widow, where the atmosphere is one of raw tragedy and the beginning of a new alliance. You see the way she looked at the burning ranch, her eyes filled with a hollow, burning light that matched the fire. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and charred timber. The sound of the wind whipping the flames was a high and hissing whisper, signaling that the safety of her old life was gone forever. Arthur moved with a sturdy and balanced power, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and leading her toward a horse, realizing that the gang had just taken on another mouth to feed and another soul to protect. The walk back toward the camp at Coulter was a story of a heavy burden. The wagons were now loaded with sacks of flour, salted meat, and crates of ammunition stolen from the O'Driscolls. This was a moment of raw and physical relief for the group, but it was tempered by the presence of Sadie and the news of Combs' plans. The atmosphere was somber and still, a realization that the war was expanding. This part of the history is a story of the stolen supplies, where the necessity of survival met the brutality of the raid. The sound of the wagons creaking under the weight of the food was a dull and rhythmic groan, making the outlaws feel solid and heavy as they returned to their people. Dutch moved with a sturdy and measured might, already thinking about the train robbery mentioned in the stolen papers, realizing that the way of the gang was now a path of the rising fire. deep in the heart of the camp that night, the final trial of the fifth part took place, as the gang shared the first real meal they had eaten in days. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that they had gained a temporary victory over the hunger. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared pot, where the smell of stew filled the cabins and the tension of the previous days began to melt away. The conversation was low and focused on Sadie, who sat in the corner of the main cabin, silent and staring into the flames. The sound of the blizzard hitting the walls was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was still the world outside. But at least they were no longer fighting it on an empty stomach. The experience of the raid ends with Arthur standing by the fire, looking at the maps they had taken from the ranch. The gray of the morning had led to a sovereignty of the orange firelight. He carried the weight of the new responsibility and the silence of the woman they had saved. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the train robbers. The focus would now shift to the planning of the heist. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the iron into a world of steam engines, dynamite, and the final attempt to get enough money to escape the mountains for good. The final legacy of the fifth part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the common cause. You have seen the outlaws raid the hollow and find the food and the survivor within the wreckage. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the tragedy as the red glow of the ranch fire faded into the evening shadows and the first white stars appeared over Coulter. You feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its fifth resolution in the discovery of Sadie Adler, leaving behind the world of the hunt for a world of the heist, the rail, and a journey that was becoming a march toward a new destiny. The plan to rob the train began with the arrival of the spring thaw, as the heavy snows of the Grizzlies finally started to melt into the mountain streams. Dutch had studied the papers stolen from the O'Driscolls and realized that a private train belonging to the wealthy industrialist Leviticus Cornwall was scheduled to pass through the high iron passes nearby. The atmosphere here was electric, cold, and heavy with anticipation. The ground beneath the horses was a slushy mix of melting ice and dark mud that splashed against the men's boots as they rode toward the tracks. The air tasted of wet stone and the sharp, chemical scent of the dynamite that Bill Williamson was carrying in his saddlebags. The sound of the world was a constant and rhythmic drip, the sound of the mountains shedding their winter skin, making the gang feel like they were finally waking up from a long sleep. Dutch led the way with a renewed sense of purpose, believing that this score would be the one to finally get them out of the cold. As the men reached the high ridge overlooking the iron rails, the atmosphere shifted to one of intense technical focus. They found a narrow cut in the mountain where the tracks ran through a deep gorge, a perfect place to bring a steaming engine to a halt. This was the era of the iron heist, where the atmosphere was one of held breaths and the careful unwinding of copper wire. You could see the way Bill struggled with the detonator, his fingers numb from the cold as he tried to set the charges under the tracks. This part of the history is a story of the failed spark, as the dynamite failed to explode when the train first rounded the corner. The sound of the massive engine approaching was a deep and bone-shaking rumble, a noise that grew into a deafening roar of steam and grinding metal. The outlaws moved with a sturdy and measured might, realizing they would have to take the train by force since the trap had failed to spring. Deep within the gorge, the atmosphere became cramped and incredibly dangerous the moment Arthur jumped from the cliff onto the roof of the moving train. He was followed by Lenny and Javier, their boots clashing against the cold metal as they fought to stay upright against the wind. This was the trial of the speeding iron, where the atmosphere became one of blurring scenery and the heavy smell of coal smoke. The warriors found that the train was heavily guarded by Cornwall's private security, men who were well armed and determined to protect the payroll. The sound of bullets hitting the steel cars was a high and ringing snap, making the train feel like the inside of a metal tunnel. This part of the history is a realization that the gang was no longer fighting local law, but the private army of one of the richest men in America. Arthur felt the steady pulse in his ears and the constant pressure of the wind against his back, a feeling of total and grounded focus. At the center of the train, the group finally reached the armored car where the bonds were kept. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suffocating, as the men used a small charge of dynamite to blow the heavy iron doors off their hinges. This was the trial of the vault, where the atmosphere became one of smoke and the glittering light of the lanterns reflecting off the stacks of paper bonds. The sound of the explosion was a deep and final boom that echoed through the mountain pass, signaling to the rest of the gang that the prize was theirs. When they stepped inside and saw the wealth they had captured, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and adrenaline-soaked stillness. They began to gather the bonds, but the victory was interrupted by the sound of more guards approaching from the back of the train. Leaving the tracks, the journey led to a fast escape as the gang rode away into the trees, the steam from the stalled engine still rising into the cold air behind them. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and triumphant, a realization that they had finally secured enough money to move the camp. This part of the history is a story of the high-speed success, where the atmosphere is one of relief and the beginning of a new chapter. You see the way the men looked at the thick envelopes of bonds, their faces lit by a rare sense of hope. The air was cold, but carried the taste of pine and the first faint warmth of the sun. The sound of the wind through the valleys was a low and musical note, signaling that the mountains were finally letting them go. Arthur moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand clutching the satchel of bonds, realizing that they had finally beaten the winter. The walk through the camp at Coulter for the last time was a story of a quick departure. The wagons were packed with the stolen supplies, the sick were loaded into the back, and the fires were finally allowed to go out. This was a moment of raw and physical transition. The atmosphere was somber and still, a realization that they were leaving behind the graves of Davy and Jenny in the snow. This part of the history is a story of the mountain's exit, where the necessity of the move met the memory of the loss. The sound of the wagon wheels on the thawing road was a dull and rhythmic crunch, making the outlaws feel solid and heavy as they descended toward the green heart of the country. Dutch moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes fixed on the horizon, realizing that the way of the gang was now a path of the rising sun. Deep in the heart of the journey south, the final trial of the sixth part took place as the gang reached the edge of the mountains and saw the vast, rolling grasslands of the heartlands. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that they had survived the worst the world could throw at them. This is a story of the sovereignty of the open view, where the smell of fresh grass and damp earth replaced the scent of the frost. The conversation was hopeful and focused on a new camp location called Horseshoe Overlook, a high plateau with a commanding view of the valley. The sound of the horses trotting on the dry road was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy of the cold was now behind them. But the search for a new life was just beginning. The experience of the train robbery ends with Arthur standing on the edge of the new camp, looking out over the green world below. The white of the mountain had led to a sovereignty of the golden sun. He carried the weight of the new wealth and the silence of the journey. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the hidden valley. The focus would now shift to the rebuilding of their lives and the interactions with the nearby town of Valentine. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the spring into a world of muddy streets, local business, and the hope that they could stay hidden long enough to make a real plan. The final legacy of the sixth part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the new beginning. You have seen the outlaws rob the iron horse and find the fortune within the metal heart. You have felt the sting of the smoke and the weight of the bonds. As the golden glow of the sunset faded over the plains of the heartlands, and the first warm breeze of the valley reached the camp, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Linde gang finds its sixth resolution in the arrival at Horseshoe Overlook, leaving behind the world of the ice for a world of the grass, the sun, and a journey that was finally finding its rhythm in a land that felt like home. The move to Horseshoe Overlook brought a change in the air and the spirit of the group. The camp was now set on a high plateau that looked out over the green, rolling hills of the heartlands. The atmosphere here was warm, bright, and filled with a sense of relief. The ground beneath the camp was firm earth covered in thick grass, a far cry from the waist-deep snow of the mountains. The air tasted of sweet clover and the dry dust of the plains. The sound of the world was a low and constant hum of insects and the distant lowing of cattle, making the gang feel like they had finally found a place to catch their breath. Dutch spent his mornings sitting outside his tent, reading his books and talking about the future, while the rest of the gang began the work of building a home. This part of the history is a story of the high plateau, a realization that the survival of the group depended on blending into this new landscape. Arthur Morgan was tasked with taking some of the women, Uncle, Mary Bate, Karen, and Tilly, into the nearby town of Valentine to see what the local situation was like. The atmosphere shifted to one of cautious curiosity as they drove the wagon down from the overlook. They found a town that was built on mud and livestock, a place of wooden boardwalks and loud saloons that felt much more like the world they knew than the brick streets of Blackwater. This was the era of the cattle town, where the atmosphere was one of muddy boots and the smell of manure. You see the way the sunlight hit the storefronts, casting long shadows across the main street. This part of the history is a story of the public face, a realization that the gang had to act like normal travelers to avoid drawing attention. The sound of the horses trotting on the timber bridges was a sharp and hollow note, a noise that signaled their entry into the world of men once again. Deep within the center of Valentine, the atmosphere became crowded and lively. Arthur left the women to explore, while he and Uncle headed to the saloon to get a drink and listen for news. This was the trial of the local gossip, where the atmosphere became one of clinking glasses and the heavy smell of tobacco. The warriors found that the town was full of people passing through, making it easy to disappear into the noise. The sound of a piano playing a fast tune was a constant and rhythmic clatter, making the saloon feel like the inside of a music box. This part of the history is a realization that even in a small town, the reach of the law and the memory of their crimes were never far away. Arthur felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the stranger's eyes, a feeling of total and grounded vigilance. While waiting for the women to finish their shopping, the atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and sharp danger. Arthur was standing outside the general store when he was approached by a man who looked at him with a look of slow recognition. This man had been in Blackwater during the disaster and remembered seeing Arthur's face. This was the trial of the past's shadow, where the atmosphere became one of cold sweat and the hidden grip on a revolver. The sound of the man's voice asking if they had met before was a thin and piercing note, making the busy street feel like the inside of a silent room. Arthur realized that the safety they had found at the overlook was an illusion. When the man panicked and tried to flee on his horse, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and frantic motion. The chase that followed was a story of a desperate silence. Arthur had to stop the man before he could reach the local sheriff and tell him that the Van der Linde gang was nearby. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and fast as Arthur galloped through the outskirts of Valentine, pushing his horse to catch the witness. This part of the history is a story of the loose end, where the atmosphere is one of hard riding and the spray of mud. You see the way the witness's horse struggled to climb a steep ridge, eventually losing its footing and throwing the man toward a cliff edge. The air was warm and carried the taste of dirt and grass. The sound of the horse's panicked whinny was a high and grating rattle, signaling that the chase was reaching its end. Arthur moved with a sturdy and measured might, cornering the man at the edge of the drop, realizing that the survival of the gang required him to silence those who remembered the blood of Blackwater. The interaction at the cliffside was a story of a heavy choice. Arthur looked at the man hanging from the ledge, his fingers slipping on the loose rock. This was a moment of raw and private reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the ghost of Blackwater was going to follow them wherever they went. This part of the history is a story of the witness's fate, where the mercy of the man met the necessity of the outlaw. The sound of the wind whistling through the rocks was a dull and respectful thud, making Arthur feel solid and heavy in a world that was trying to pull him back into the fire. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, eventually deciding to let the man go after a terrifying warning, realizing that the way of the gang was now a path of constant looking over the shoulder. Deep in the heart of the town later that evening, the final trial of the 7th part took place as Arthur collected the women and headed back toward the camp. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that they had gained some supplies but lost their anonymity. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared secret, where they sat in the wagon and talked about the clothes they had seen and the people they had met. The conversation was light, but Arthur remained quiet, thinking about the man at the cliff. The sound of the wagon wheels on the soft grass of the overlook was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was no longer the mountain, but the memory of the people they had robbed. The experience at Valentine ends with Arthur standing at the edge of the plateau, looking down at the lights of the town in the valley below. The gold of the sunset had led to a sovereignty of the purple twilight. He carried the weight of the recognition and the silence of the warning. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the hidden presence. The focus would now shift to the work for the local ranchers and the growing influence of the gang in the territory. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the summer into a world of cattle drives, debt collection, and the realization that the law was slowly closing the circle, the final legacy of the 7th part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the hidden face. You have seen the outlaws enter the town and find the danger within the crowd. You have felt the sting of the recognition and the weight of the chase. As the red glow of the camp lanterns faded into the shadows of the trees and the first stars appeared over the heartlands, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its 7th resolution in the encounter at Valentine, leaving behind the world of the ice for a world of the mud, the sun, and a journey that was becoming a struggle to stay forgotten. The work in Valentine grew more frequent as the summer heat began to bake the mud of the streets into a hard, dusty crust. The gang had settled into a rhythm of finding small jobs to keep the camp funded, but the tension of being recognized was always there. The atmosphere here was busy, hot, and rowdy. The ground beneath the horses was a mix of dried manure and loose dirt that rose in small clouds as the cattle were driven through the center of town. The air tasted of cheap whiskey, roasted meat, and the heavy scent of unwashed men. The sound of the world was a low and constant clatter of hammers and the shouting of traders, making Valentine feel like a place that was trying to build itself faster than it could think. This part of the history is a story of the cattle town's pulse, a realization that the gang was slowly becoming part of the local scenery. Arthur Morgan found himself back in the local saloon with Bill and some of the others, looking for a bit of relaxation after a long day of debt collection. The atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and explosive violence when a local tough guy took offense to Bill's presence. This was the era of the barroom brawl, where the atmosphere was one of flying glass and the heavy thud of fists against wood. You see the way the tables were overturned and the lanterns swayed as the entire building erupted into a massive fight. This part of the history is a story of the public brawl, a realization that the gang's temper was as much of a threat to their safety as the law. The sound of a chair breaking over a man's back was a sharp and splintering crack, a noise that signaled the end of the quiet evening. The outlaws moved with a sturdy and measured might, throwing punches and dodging bottles, feeling the steady heat of the adrenaline and the raw weight of the chaos. Deep within the mud of the street outside the saloon, the fight spilled out into the open air. Arthur was tackled into the muck by a massive man named Tommy, and the atmosphere became cramped and suffocating. The two men rolled in the wet dirt, their breathing heavy and ragged as they fought for dominance. This was the trial of the muddy earth, where the atmosphere became one of grit and the iron taste of blood. The warriors found that the spectators were cheering from the boardwalks, turning a private dispute into a public spectacle. The sound of the punches hitting home was a dull and rhythmic thud, making the street feel like the inside of a drum. This part of the history is a realization that Arthur's strength was a tool he could barely control when pushed. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, eventually beating Tommy into the ground, realizing that the survival of his pride was a messy business. At the center of the town square, the fight was finally interrupted by a man who looked like he belonged in a different world. Dutch van der Linde arrived just as the brawl ended, but he was not alone. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suddenly very cold as a group of well-dressed men on fine horses rode into the light. This was the trial of the industrial giant, where the atmosphere became one of sharp silence and the glint of expensive steel. The man leading them was Leviticus Cornwall, the owner of the train they had robbed in the mountains. He had spent a fortune to track the gang down, and he had finally caught them in the open. The sound of Cornwall's voice was a thin and piercing note, making the rowdy town feel like the inside of a courtroom. The confrontation that followed was a story of a one-sided war. Cornwall didn't want a fair fight. He wanted his property back, and the men who took it dead. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and lethal as Cornwall's hired gunmen took positions on the balconies and roofs. This part of the history is a story of the Cornwall ambush, where the atmosphere is one of lead and the spray of splinters. You see the way the townspeople scrambled for cover as the first shots were fired into the street. The air was warm and carried the taste of gunpowder and dry timber. The sound of a Gatling gun being prepared in the distance was a high and grating rattle, signaling that the gang was completely outgunned. Arthur moved with a sturdy and measured might, grabbing Dutch and pushing him toward cover, realizing that the safety of the Heartlands had been destroyed in a single afternoon. The escape from Valentine was a story of a frantic retreat through a town that had turned into a shooting gallery. Arthur and the others had to fight their way to their horses, while Cornwall's men rained fire down on them from every direction. This was a moment of raw and heavy reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still for a second before the world exploded again. This part of the history is a story of the bullet-torn street, where the tradition of the gunfight met the reality of the industrial machine. The sound of the horses' hooves on the timber was a sharp and hollow note, making the outlaws feel solid and heavy as they galloped out of the crossfire. They moved with a sturdy and balanced power, leaving behind a town that would never forget the day the Van der Linde gang brought their war to the front door. Deep in the heart of the woods outside of town, the final trial of the 8th part took place as the gang stopped to assess the damage. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that Horseshoe Overlook was no longer safe. This is a story of the sovereignty of the forced move, where they realized that Cornwall had the resources to follow them across the entire country. The conversation was short and focused on the immediate need to pack up and vanish once again. The sound of the wind through the pines was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was no longer just the local sheriff, but the private interest of a man who owned the very rails they rode on. The experience at Valentine ends with the gang looking back at the smoke rising from the town. The gold of the afternoon had led to a sovereignty of the gray smoke. They carried the weight of the failed anonymity and the silence of a new, powerful enemy. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the constant flight. The focus would now shift to the move south toward the swamps of Lemon. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the heat into a world of red dirt, old plantations, and the realization that they were running out of places to hide. The final legacy of the 8th part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the narrow escape. You have seen the outlaws fight in the mud and the smoke to find the exit within the ambush. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the Cornwall name. As the orange glow of the camp lanterns faded into the shadows of the move, and the first humid air of the south reached the wagons, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its 8th resolution in the flight from Valentine, leaving behind the world of the grass for a world of the swamp, the heat, and a journey that was becoming a long walk toward the end of the line. The move south into the territory of Lemon brought a heavy change to the air and the surroundings of the Van der Linde gang. They left the dry, golden plains of the heartlands and entered a world of red dirt, thick humidity, and ancient trees draped in gray moss. The atmosphere here was thick, hot, and heavy, with the scent of damp earth and stagnant water. The ground beneath the wagons was a soft, iron-red clay that stuck to everything, turning the horses' legs the color of rust. The air tasted of salt, decaying vegetation, and the sweet, cloying smell of night-blooming flowers. The sound of the world was a constant and high-pitched drone of cicadas, and the deep croaking of bullfrogs in the nearby marshes, making the gang feel like they were being swallowed by a green, living wall. They settled into a new camp at Clemens Point, a beautiful but isolated stretch of land on the edge of the Flatiron Lake. This part of the history is a story of the Southern Deep, a realization that to survive here, they would have to learn the secrets of a land still haunted by the ghosts of a different war. Arthur Morgan and Dutch soon discovered that Lemon was ruled by 2 powerful families who had been at war with each other for generations, the Greys and the Braithwaites. The atmosphere shifted to one of political intrigue as Dutch decided to play both sides against each other, hoping to steal the legendary gold that was rumored to be hidden on their plantations. This was the era of the blood feud, where the atmosphere was one of polite smiles and hidden daggers. You see the way the massive plantation houses stood like monuments to a dead age, surrounded by fields of tobacco and cotton. This part of the history is a story of the double game, a realization that the gang was walking a very thin line between 2 different kinds of fire. The sound of a heavy gate closing at the end of a long driveway was a sharp and final note, a noise that signaled the entry into a world of old money and deep-seated hatred. Deep within the dusty town of Rhodes, the atmosphere became cramped and incredibly tense. Arthur was appointed as a deputy for the Grey family, wearing a silver star while secretly working for the Braithwaites on the side. This was the trial of the dual identity, where the atmosphere became one of watching every word and measuring every look. The warriors found that the town was a place where everyone was related and everyone was watching. The sound of the red dust blowing against the wooden storefronts was a constant and dry hiss, making Rhodes feel like it was slowly being buried by its own history. This part of the history is a realization that the gang's presence was like a spark in a room full of gunpowder. Arthur felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the southern sun against his neck, a feeling of total and grounded focus. At the center of the Braithwaite Manor, Arthur and the others were tasked with burning the family's prized tobacco fields to weaken their position. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and suffocating as they moved through the tall rows of leaves under the cover of night. This was the trial of the fire raiser, where the atmosphere became one of intense heat and the roar of the flames. The sound of the moonshine jars breaking as they spread the accelerant was a sharp and hollow note, making the fields feel like the inside of a tinderbox. This part of the history is a story of the burning crop, where the smell of expensive tobacco turned into the choking stench of ash. When the fire finally took hold, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and orange stillness. They watched the flames climb toward the sky, realizing that they had just declared war on a family that did not know how to forgive. Leaving the burning fields, the journey led back to the quiet camp at Clemens Point. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and deceptively peaceful as the gang counted their small earnings and waited for the next move. This part of the history is a story of the calm before the storm, where the atmosphere is one of false security and the beginning of the end for the gang's luck. You see the way the moonlight reflected off the lake, looking like a sheet of silver glass. The air was warm and carried the taste of smoke and lake water. The sound of the waves hitting the shore was a low and musical note, signaling that the water was the only thing in Lemon that wasn't trying to hide a secret. Arthur moved with a sturdy and balanced power, cleaning his weapons by the fire, realizing that the way of the gang was now a path of the double cross. The walk through the streets of Rhodes the next day was a story of a growing shadow. The Greys and the Braithwaites were starting to realize that they were being played, and the tension in the town was reaching a breaking point. This was a moment of raw and heavy reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the gang's plan was unraveling faster than they could fix it. This part of the history is a story of the suspicious glance, where the tradition of the Southern hospitality met the reality of the outlaw's greed. The sound of his boots on the red dirt was a sharp and respectful click, making Arthur feel solid and heavy in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. He moved with a sturdy and measured power, realizing that the game they were playing was about to have a very high price. Deep in the heart of the camp at night, the final trial of the 9th part took place as Bill Williamson returned with news that the Greys had a job for them in town. The atmosphere was intimate, warm, and resolute, a realization that they had to finish the job before the families turned on them. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared lie, where they sat around the fire and planned their final move in Rhodes. The conversation was confident, but there was an underlying sense of dread that even Dutch couldn't hide. The The sound of the owls in the cypress trees was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was no longer just the law, but the very families they were trying to rob. The experience at Clemens Point ends with the gang preparing to ride into Rhodes for what they thought was one last job. The red of the dirt had led to a sovereignty of the blood-stained horizon. They carried the weight of the double cross and the silence of the burning fields. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the inevitable clash. The focus would now shift to the ambush in the streets of Rhodes. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the lead into a world of falling brothers, burning mansions, and the total destruction of the two families, the final legacy of the 9th part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the dangerous game. You have seen the outlaws enter the swamp and find the conflict within the old houses. You have felt the sting of the heat and the weight of the red clay. As the golden glow of the southern sun faded into the evening shadows and the first light of the fireflies appeared over the marsh, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its 9th resolution in the involvement with the families of Lemon, leaving behind the world of the grass for a world of the mud, the heat, and a journey that was about to turn into a bloodbath. The ride into Rhodes on that afternoon felt different from the very start. The air was unusually still, and the heat of the lemon sun seemed to press down on the red dirt streets with a heavy, suffocating weight. Dutch had sent Arthur, Bill, Micah, and Sean MacGyre into town to meet with the Greys for what they believed was a final payoff. The atmosphere here was quiet, expectant, and brittle. The ground beneath the horses was a fine red powder that rose in small clouds, coating their boots and the hems of their coats in the color of old rust. The air tasted of dry dust and the metallic scent of the rifles leaning against the storefronts. The sound of the world was a low and constant creak of the wooden signs swaying in the wind, making the town feel like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. This part of the history is a story of the short walk, a realization that the gang had walked into a town that had finally stopped pretending to be their friend. The transition from a quiet walk to a scene of total violence happened in the blink of an eye. As the group moved past the local gunsmith, a single shot rang out from a second-story window. The atmosphere shifted to one of sudden and absolute shock as Sean MacGyre was struck in the head, falling to the red dirt before he could even draw his weapon. This was the era of the town square ambush, where the atmosphere was one of whistling lead and the spray of splinters. You see the way the gang scrambled for cover behind the heavy freight wagons, their faces pale with the realization that one of their youngest and most cheerful members was gone. This part of the history is a story of the Greys' revenge, a realization that the family had known about the double cross all along. The sound of the repeated rifle fire was a sharp and deafening crack, making the street feel like the inside of a shooting gallery. Arthur moved with a sturdy and measured might, his heart heavy with the sight of Sean, realizing that the game in Lemon had just claimed its first life. Deep within the center of the town, the gunfight became a desperate struggle to push back the Greys and escape the trap. Arthur and Bill fought through the local office of the sheriff, the air thick with the smell of black powder and the choking dust of the red streets. This was the trial of the trapped outlaws, where the atmosphere became one of frantic motion and the constant thud of bullets hitting the wooden boardwalks. The warriors found that the townspeople had vanished, leaving only the lawmen and the Grey family gunmen to hunt them down. The sound of the heavy revolvers firing in the narrow alleys was a deep and echoing roar, making the town feel like a stone maze filled with fire. This part of the history is a realization that the gang was being hunted by the very people they had tried to fool. Arthur felt the steady pulse in his wrist and the constant pressure of the smoke against his eyes, a feeling of total and grounded focus. After fighting their way out of Rhodes and returning to camp, the atmosphere shifted to one of cold, focused fury. They discovered that while they were being ambushed in town, the Braithwaite family had kidnapped young Jack Marston, the son of Abigail and John. This was the trial of the missing child, where the atmosphere became one of dark intent and the sharpening of blades. The gang gathered every man they had and rode toward the Braithwaite Manor at sunset. This part of the history is a story of the March of the Ghost, where the atmosphere is one of absolute silence and the rhythmic clatter of 20 horses moving as one. You see the way the long, tree-lined driveway of the manor stretched out before them, looking like a path into the heart of a nightmare. The air was warm and carried the taste of salt and the heavy scent of the swamp. At the front of the Braithwaite Manor, the group encountered a wall of guards protecting the ancient stone pillars of the house. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and terrifying as the gang moved in a single line across the grass, firing with a cold and mechanical precision. This was the trial of the manor's fall, where the atmosphere became one of rising smoke and the screams of a family that had finally met a predator they couldn't buy. Sound of the windows shattering under the weight of the lead was a sharp and constant pop, making the house feel like the inside of a breaking shell. When the gang finally breached the front doors and cornered Catherine Braithwaite, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and orange stillness. They realized that Jack had already been taken away and given to a man in the city of St. Denis. In a fit of vengeful rage, the gang set the entire manor on fire, leaving the old woman to watch her history burn to the ground. Leaving the burning ruins, the journey led back toward the lake under the light of the massive fire. The atmosphere was vast, quiet, and somber, a realization that they had destroyed 2 families but had failed to bring the boy home. This part of the history is a story of the hollow victory, where the atmosphere is one of exhaustion and the taste of ash. You see the way the flames reflected in the eyes of the men as they rode away, their silhouettes looking like dark shadows against the red sky. The air was hot and carried the taste of smoke and the dry scent of burning silk. The sound of the manor's roof collapsing was a deep and final boom, signaling that the era of the plantation feud was over, replaced by the era of the urban hunt. The walk through the camp at Clemens Point that night was a story of a group that was finally starting to break. They had lost Sean, and Jack was still in the hands of strangers. This was a moment of raw and heavy reality. The atmosphere was somber and very still, a realization that the move to Lemon had been a catastrophic mistake. This part of the history is a story of the grieving mother, where the tradition of the gang's protection met the reality of the parents' pain. The sound of Abigail's quiet sobbing in the dark was a thin and piercing note, making the outlaws feel solid and heavy as they prepared for the next move. Dutch moved with a sturdy and measured power, his face illuminated by the dying campfire, realizing that the way of the gang was now a path into the belly of the machine. Deep in the heart of the night, the final trial of the 10th part took place as the gang packed their bags to leave Clemens Point forever. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that they had to find a new hiding place closer to the city. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared loss, where they looked at the empty space where Sean used to sit and realized that the circle was getting smaller. The conversation was short and focused on the city of St. Denis and the man named Angelo Brant, who now held the boy. The sound of the lake water hitting the shore was a constant and heavy thrum, signaling that the true enemy was no longer the red dirt, but the shadows of the city. The experience at Rhodes and the manor ends with the gang looking toward the distant, glowing fog of St. Denis on the horizon. The red of the dirt had led to a sovereignty of the gray stone. They carried the weight of the fallen brother and the silence of the missing child. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the urban rescue. The focus would now shift to the streets of the city and the deal with the Italian boss. As the history prepared to follow the trail of the iron into a world of streetcars, high society, and the realization that the old world was finally dead. The final legacy of the 10th part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the vengeful fire. You have seen the outlaws lose their own and burn the houses of their enemies to find the strength within their own circle. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the fire. As the red glow of the Braithwaite Manor faded into the evening shadows and the first lights of the city appeared through the trees, you feel a sense of simple and grounded disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its 10th resolution in the destruction of the families, leaving behind the world of the plantation for a world of the city, the stone, and a journey that was becoming a desperate search for a way home. The move into St. Denis felt like stepping into a different century. The Van der Linde gang left the marshes of Lemon and entered a world of cold stone, iron rails, and thick, black chimney smoke. This was the city of the future, a place where the air was no longer filled with the scent of the swamp, but with the heavy, choking smell of coal and industrial grease. The atmosphere here was gray, loud, and smothering, and the ground beneath the horses was no longer red dirt, but hard, wet cobblestones that made a constant, rhythmic clatter. The air tasted of soot, old iron, and the sharp scent of the harbor. The sound of the world was a constant and heavy hum, the sound of streetcars, factory whistles, and thousands of people living on top of each other, making the gang feel like small, primitive shadows in a world of machines. Dutch led them to a new hiding place in a crumbling estate called Shady Bell, realizing that to get Jack back, he would have to play a game with the kings of the city. The search for Jack led them to the doorstep of Angelo Bront, a man who ruled the city's underworld from a massive marble palace. The atmosphere shifted to one of polished danger. They found a world of silk curtains, expensive wine, and men in tailored suits who carried hidden daggers. This was the era of the urban king, where the atmosphere was one of fake smiles and heavy debt. You see the way Bront looked down at the outlaws, treating them like a curiosity from a dead age. This part of the history is a story of the deal with the devil, a realization that Bront would only return the boy if the gang did his dirty work for him. The sound of the city's clock tower striking the hour was a sharp and industrial note, a noise that marked the time they were losing. Arthur moved with a sturdy and measured might, his eyes tracking the guards in the shadows, feeling the steady heat of the gaslights and the raw weight of the city on his shoulders, a feeling of total and grounded focus. After a successful raid on a local cemetery to clear out some of Bront's rivals, the boy was finally returned to the gang. The atmosphere at Shady Bell became intimate, warm, and resolute for a brief moment as Abigail held her son again. This was a story of the brief light, where the camp celebrated with music and fire, trying to forget that they were surrounded by enemies. But the peace did not last. Bront had insulted Dutch, and Dutch's pride had become a volatile and dangerous fire. This part of the history is a realization that the gang was no longer just trying to survive. They were looking for revenge. The sound of the wind through the cypress trees was a low and constant moan, signaling that the spirit of the gang was becoming as dark as the city itself. The plan for the final score, the robbery of the St. Denis Bank, was born out of Dutch's growing desperation. He believed that if they could just get the gold from the city's largest vault, they could buy a boat and disappear to a tropical island. The atmosphere was vast, tense, and brittle, as the gang rode into the heart of the city in their finest clothes, trying to look like businessmen. This was the trial of the great gamble, where the atmosphere became one of muffled footsteps and the smell of rain. The warriors found that the bank was a colossal stone fortress, its marble floors reflecting the morning light like a mirror of fate. The sound of the bank doors closing behind them was a deep and final thud, making the air feel like it was filled with the weight of a trap. The robbery turned into a nightmare the moment they stepped outside with the money. The Pinkertons, led by Agent Milton, were already waiting in the street with a wall of rifles and Gatling guns. This was the trial of the ultimate tragedy, where the atmosphere became one of blinding flashes and sharp cracks. You see the way the modern world finally closed the circle around the outlaws. In the chaos of the street fight, Hosea Matthews, the gang's oldest friend, and its voice of reason, was executed in front of them. The atmosphere shifted to one of raw and metallic grief, a realization that the heart of the gang had been cut out. The sound of the gunfire hitting the stone pillars was a sharp and constant snap, making the city feel like the inside of a crashing machine. Leaving the bank, the journey led to a frantic escape over the rooftops of St. Denis as the law swarmed the streets below. The atmosphere was violent, gray, and suffocating, a realization that they were losing more than just money. This part of the history is a story of the falling brothers, where the atmosphere is one of extreme fear and desperate speed. They watched as Lenny Summers, a young and promising member of the group, was shot down while jumping between buildings. The air was cold and carried the taste of salt and smoke. The sound of the ocean waves at the docks was a deep and harmonic note, signaling that the only way out was the dark water of the harbor. Arthur moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand helping Dutch toward a cargo ship, realizing that the way of the gang had led them to a graveyard of stone. Deep in the heart of the ship's cargo hold at night, the final trial of the 11th part took place as the survivors sat in the dark, listening to the engine throb. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that they had lost everything: their friends, their money, and their home. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared silence, where they realized that the dream of the gang was finally dead. The conversation was over. There was only the sound of the water against the hull and the heavy breathing of broken men. The sound of a distant foghorn from the harbor was a long and lonesome note, signaling that the true enemy was now the horizon itself. The experience at St. Denis ends with the ship moving out into a massive storm, leaving the lights of the city behind. The gray of the stone had led to a sovereignty of the Black Ocean. They carried the weight of Hosea's death and the silence of the defeat. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the gang was now a path of the shipwreck. The focus would now shift to the Isle of Guam, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the salt into a world of tropical heat, sugar plantations, and the final realization that there is no escape from the past. The final legacy of the 11th part of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the crushed spirit. You have seen the outlaws enter the city and find the end of their era within the stone streets. You have felt the sting of the lead and the weight of the loss. As the orange glow of the burning city faded into the evening shadows, and the first waves of the open sea hit the deck, you feel a sense of simple and sacred disaster. The story of the Van der Linde gang finds its 11th and grounded resolution in the fall of Hosea, leaving behind the world of the city for a world of the island, the storm, and a journey that was entering its final, darkest hour. The survivors of the St. Denis disaster found themselves cast onto the white sands of Guam, a tropical island where the world was made of crushing heat, green jungles, and the bitter sweat of slaves. This was the end of the line, a place where the air was no longer thick with coal smoke, but with the heavy, humid scent of sugar cane and tropical rot. The atmosphere here was blinding, suffocating, and lethal, and the ground beneath Arthur's bare feet was a mix of hot sand and sharp coral that cut into the skin. The air tasted of salt, old iron, and the sharp chemical bite of the lime pits. The sound of the world was a constant and massive roar, the sound of the ocean hitting the reefs with a force that made the entire island feel like a colossal, natural cage. Dutch led the broken men toward the cover of the trees, realizing that on Guam, the danger was the realization that there was nowhere left to run. As the gang was captured and chained by the local military, the atmosphere shifted to one of rising despair. They found a world of iron shackles and stone fortresses, where the workers were treated like discarded tools of the empire. This is the era of the Island War, where the atmosphere was one of unstable footing and splashing blood. You see the way the guards watched them from the high towers, their rifles glinting in the sun like the eyes of 100 insects. This part of the history is a story of the chain gang, a realization that the ghost of the West had been reduced to prisoner in paradise. The sound of the chains rattling against the stones was a sharp and rhythmic clang, a noise that marked the countdown to the first execution. Arthur moved with a sturdy and measured might, his body swaying with the weight of the iron, feeling the cold sweat on his face and the steady vibration of the earth beneath his feet, a feeling of total and grounded exhaustion. Deep within the jungle during their escape, the atmosphere became cramped and explosive. Arthur had to navigate through thick vines and hidden traps, moving through a space that was so tight he could hear the heartbeat of the soldiers in the brush. This was the trial of the hidden strike, where the atmosphere became one of muffled footsteps and the smell of sulfur. The warriors found that the air was hot and carried the taste of old sweat and wet moss, a realization that the jungle was a tinderbox waiting for a single flame. The sound of the monkeys screaming in the canopy was a deep and grating shriek, making the forest feel like the inside of a green throat. This part of the history is a realization that to leave the island, they had to become the storm that broke the chains of the workers. He felt the steady pulse in the wrist and the constant pressure of the heat against his head, a feeling of total and grounded focus. At the center of the fortress of Cinco Torres, the group encountered the island's governor, a man who used a massive, iron-plated cannon to fire on the rebels with a wild and bone-crushing force. The fight was a story of the steel against the empire. The atmosphere was violent, bright, and brittle as the fort tilted under the weight of the naval bombardment, sending stone and fire flying across the deck like heavy dice. This is the trial of the sinking shore, where the atmosphere became one of sudden leaps and sharp impacts. Arthur had to move with a brutal and direct power, his rifle cutting through the smoke with a sound like stone hitting ice. The sound of the cannonballs hitting the stone was a deep and final roar, making the air feel like it was filled with the weight of the ocean. When the governor finally fell into the dark water below, the atmosphere shifted to a heavy and searing stillness, a realization that the way back to America was finally open. Leaving the island, the journey led back to the shores of Lemon, where the gang reunited at the ruins of Linde. The atmosphere was vast, gray, and haunted, a realization that the island of Guam had changed Dutch forever. This part of the history is a story of the final split, where the atmosphere was one of extreme suspicion and howling betrayal. You see the way Dutch looked at his men, his eyes filled with a cold and empty hunger. The air was hot and carried the taste of salt and burning oil. The sound of the swamp groaning in the night was a sharp and constant pop, signaling that the chain of the gang had finally been broken by the fire of the city. The walk through the final camp at Beaver Hollow was a story of the ghost of a life. Arthur stood in the mouth of the dark cave as the remains of the gang argued over their last coins, their faces looking like the bones of a dead civilization. This was a moment of raw and metallic grief. The atmosphere was somber and still, a realization that the Pinkertons were only minutes away, and the traitor was sitting at their fire. This part of the history is a story of the sunken legacy, where the victory of the gang was written in the debris of the tide. The sound of his boots on the cold gravel was a dull and respectful thud, making Arthur feel solid and heavy in a world that was being washed clean by the rain. He moved with a sturdy and balanced power, his hand picking up his hat, realizing that the way of the outlaw was a path that left nothing but ashes and water in its wake. Deep in the heart of the mountain peak at dawn, the final trial of the 12th part took place as Arthur faced Micah Bell for the last time. The atmosphere was intimate, cold, and resolute, a realization that the sun was setting on the era of the outlaws. This is a story of the sovereignty of the shared breath, where they listened to the sound of the wind and realized that the island of the gang was gone forever. The conversation was over. There is only the sound of the blood and the crackle of the frost. The sound of a distant eagle crying in the dark was a long and lonesome note, signaling that the true enemy was the silence that follows a great destruction. The experience of the Blackwater Disaster ends with Arthur standing at the edge of the world, looking toward the rising sun. The black of the sand has led to a sovereignty of the red sky. He carries the weight of the gang's destruction and the silence of the savior. The atmosphere was one of quiet and hardened resolve, a realization that the path of the outlaw was now a path of the final reckoning. The focus would now shift to the redemption of the soul, as the history prepared to follow the trail of the light into a world of final goodbyes, quiet graves, and the final gathering of the strength needed to face the end. The final legacy of the 12 parts of the Blackwater Disaster is a story of the strength in the fading light. You have seen the warrior walk through the fire and the salt to find the power within his own spirit. You have felt the sting of the spray and the weight of the wood. As the orange glow of the mountain sunset faded into the evening shadows and the first gray mists of the future appeared on the horizon, you feel a sense of simple and sacred purpose. The story of Arthur Morgan finds its 12th and grounded resolution in the sacrifice of the self, leaving behind the world of the shore for a world of the mist, the shadow, and a journey that is reaching its peak.